Hello, everyone. I'm just going live on YouTube, just letting you all know.
Shruti ma'am, can you disable participant annotations? Under the annotations, you can click on clear all drawing.
Now you talk one second. We are live right now, so we will begin in a minute. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Before we begin, I would like to say a word about Hyderabad rains and the floods. Hyderabad has been receiving unprecedented rains, and due to this, the power is quite disrupted. If something happens at our end, because we are at Hyderabad, I'm sure our Delhi team takes over, right? So I'll hand over to Swati from Bokaro to talk about our session today. Over to you, Swati.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Subha, and the entire team from Purple Stone was here today. It is a pleasure to welcome everybody to LitQuake 2020. LitQuake is a virtual literature festival being organized by Purple Stone Publications. This session is being brought to you by Purple Stone in collaboration with Bukuru Children's Literature Festival. My name is Swati Roy, and I and my fellow director Venkatesh are here from Bukuru. Shubha and her team were really kind to invite us to curate this session for this wonderful LitQuake that they have been organizing this year. Bukuru, on the other hand, for the past 17 years has been working towards bringing children and books together through sessions such as today's. In today's session, which is titled How India Influenced the World, our speakers Archana Garodia Gupta and Shruti Garodia will discuss the different ways in which ancient India contributed to the world, from science and medicine to architecture and philosophy, and mind you, all facts, no fiction. So who are the speakers today? Archana Garodia Gupta, a successful entrepreneur and leading national quizzer, is a winner of the prestigious Champion of Champion title from BBC Mastermind. Many of you will know about the BBC Mastermind. It's really, really a big feat. She loves weaving delightful nuggets of history into engaging tales. Shruti, who is an incurable reader and writer, loves history, especially through storytelling. A graduate of Cornell University, she loves traveling across the globe and adventurous activities like sailing, diving, and trekking. Today, they will be presenting for about 45 minutes. You may submit your questions through the chat box. All questions from all the participants will be answered collectively by the speakers in the last 15 minutes of the session. Please remember to mute your mics and try not to move around during the session as that causes disturbance. And as Shubha ma'am just said, connections can be a little dicey. Don't worry, don't panic, be patient. Things will come back to it. You can always write on chat if you're not able to see or hear. We will make sure that we can send you some instructions. So get ready for a fascinating journey back into the ancient world. Over to you, Archana and Shruti. Yeah? Archana, Shruti? What's wrong?
No, Shruti, unmute.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Great. Hi.
Unmuted. Hi.
Okay.
It's just that we were not able to unmute ourselves. So, okay. Hello, everybody.
Okay.
We're all very happy to be here, Archana and I. As Swati very kindly introduced us, we've written this 2-volume book called The History of India for Children. And basically the idea is that we like to make history fun, because a lot of people tend to think of it as something that you only have to study for your exams and forget about it. But actually it can be really, really fascinating, and you can have a lot of facts which could feel like they come from a novel. And that's the kind of thing that we've tried to bring out and make it fun across these two, basically these 2 volumes. Now, basically, in India, when we think about Indian history, we always think of it as being very self-contained. You know, things were going on in India. There was not too much interaction with the world. And we were going on and lots of things were happening, except for the people who would come and invade us periodically, starting from ancient times. There was not too much two-way interaction. You know, that's the feeling one gets right up until perhaps the British time and modern times with colonialism and then globalization. But this was in fact not at all the case. You have right from recorded history, from the beginning of civilization, when people started settling down and living in, cities and towns together, you had trade, and you had trade globally, and India was very much a part of that trade. So in fact, because India and China have historically been the most populous and the most productive countries, they were considered to be the center of the world, not Europe, as we kind of think of it today. When you look at the ancient civilizations, so you had Mesopotamia, etc., even the Harappans were trading with them on a regular basis. Though the Harappans actually had ships, and they would, they were quite basic ships. They could not go on the open ocean, but they would hug the coast and go along. And Harappa in India was called Meluha. And many things have been mentioned in the Mesopotamian records and even in the Bible about things that were precious from India at that time. So you have these special Indian cats called golem, which people think were probably tigers which were exported. So you had a lot of exotic animals going. So for example, they talk about King Solomon importing ivory apes and peacocks from India, and you also have pepper. So we always think about, when we think about what India is famous for exporting around the world, you think about spices and you think about textiles. So pepper and spices, we'll talk a little bit more later on in the presentation. But textiles, we kind of decided that we're not really going to enter, because there are actually many, many other things that are very interesting, which have not become very common knowledge, which are basically India's, let's say, gift to the world, or it's because of India that these things got popularized and globalized, and many things we don't even know about it. But just to let you know, for example, how global the ancient world was. You have the pharaoh Ramses II, who was probably the pharaoh that Moses had to face off, what they write about in the Old Testament. And when they were analyzing his mummy, they realized that he had black pepper stuffed up his nose. And pepper was only grown in India, so specifically South India at that point. So clearly, even in 1200 BC, there was a robust trade going on. So that's like the first thing. And the only thing I want to mention about textiles, because that's one thing which most children will learn about in their history, and they always talk about how you have very fine muslin, which used to be famous in Rome. And that's what the Europeans, a lot of these printed fabrics became all the rage in Europe. But I think we can talk about so many topics. So we've decided to do a few of the lesser known ones. Speaking of, what is the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about what India shared with the world, or what India gave to the world, as we like to say? So you think about the zero, right? You always think that India gave zero to the world, but it's called Arabic numerals. Why is it not called the Indian numerals? So actually, it's a very interesting story of how it went to the West. So many ancient cultures, when they started developing mathematics, they knew that this concept of zero needs to be there. So they had placeholders, which means that they would leave a blank. Supposing they have to add something and a zero comes in. There was no actual number for it. It was not accorded the status of a number. And India is the one that actually has this symbol, which was this bindu, or this dot. And the earliest existing one that we have today is in the Bakshali manuscripts, which were, people say, from the 3rd century, though there's a little bit of confusion over the dating, which is where it's written very clearly that the zero is mentioned as with the dot. The other place which you can see even today, if you want to go, is in the Chaturbhuj temple in Orcha. And that's what, if you can see on the screen, that's the first symbolic representation that we can see. But that was much later. And we know for sure that Indian scientists and mathematicians were using the zero much before these manuscripts and temples as well. For example, Aryabhat could not have been doing all those calculations if he was not able to do a zero. So what happened was that there was this guy called Al-Khwarizmi. He was originally from Uzbekistan, And he was an Arabic scholar and scientist and astrologer and many things. And because Central Asia at that point was very Buddhist. So it was very firmly within the Indian sphere of influence. So, because there were many Buddhist universities, things would have been the language of learning in a lot of Central Asia would have been Sanskrit. So he would have had access to all of this scientific knowledge, which was there from the Indian subcontinent, because it was all part of the same language speaking thing and the same, kind of cultural sphere. He went and he was working for the Arabs. I mean, he wrote this short book, amongst many other things he did. He wrote this short book called On the Calculation with Hindu Numerals. Now, the Arab Empire, after the advent of Islam, it had become very large very quickly. And it actually spread all the way to the West. So it conquered a lot of Spain. And at one point it was ruling almost all of Spain, but it had about, the southern parts of Spain were being ruled by the Arabs for about 700 years. So that's a very long period of time. So between Europe and the Arab world, there was a lot of intellectual back and forth. Things were getting translated back and forth between Arabic and Latin. So around the 12th century, this Al-Khwarizmi's book was translated into Latin. And the chap called it Liber Algorismi, the Numero Indorum. So you guys might have heard of the word algorithm. We always talk about computer algorithms nowadays. So algorithm was just the way they pronounced Al-Khwarizm. So it was just the fact that it actually does not mean anything other than the way that the Europeans used to pronounce this guy's name. And because they used to learn from, because they got this whole system of numerals from the Arabs, who always said it was Indian, by the way. They started calling it the Arabic numerals, and that's why we have that. Now, India was good in many other sciences and mathematics and astronomy, etc. But many of these things had come to what that the scientists came to. The conclusions, for example, that the earth is round, etc. Other people around the world also independently came to those conclusions. So it was not necessarily that India is the one that spread those kind of pieces of knowledge. Another thing which I want to quickly talk about in this is that, but there was this scholar called Al-Biruni who accompanied Mahmud of Ghazni when he was doing his raids to India. And he was also, he really spent a lot of time, he learned Sanskrit and, he really wanted to know. He wrote a couple of books explaining all the cultures and traditions and sciences and whatever, describing India in great detail. So he did mention that Indian scientists knew that the earth was a globe. It was not flat. Many people in the ancient world used to think it was flat like a plate, the earth. And the fact that there is a force, which is something like the rudimentary description of gravity, saying that, okay, there is a force which attracts everything to the earth. And also that the earth rotated around the sun. But like I said before, these are things that other scientists around the world also came to independently. So it's not necessarily that it went from India. Incidentally, he also made a very snide remark saying that all Indians think very highly of themselves. And he said that the Indians believe that there is no country but theirs, no nation like theirs, no king like theirs, no religion like theirs, and no science like theirs. So he was just being basically a bit sarcastic, saying that they think that they're everything. So this was a little bit about the maths and sciences of India. And Archana will...
Okay. So religion and philosophy, right? India is considered to be the teacher of the world, Jagat Guru. And is that true? So I'd like to begin by saying that up till about the 17th century, 50% of the world followed Indic religions. That is, religions that had originated out of India, either Hinduism or Buddhism, or in much smaller numbers, Jainism, Sikhism, etc. So, India that way has had a huge influence on people's thinking, on their philosophy, on their religion. And we have other religions like Christianity or Islam, which has spread across the world. But there is a big difference in the way these religions spread. If you look, most of Christianity and Islam, those areas adopted these religions, which were which were being conquered and ruled by people of these religions, and later the population converted over time to Christianity and Islam. But that's not the story with India. You see, most of Asia, China, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, all converted to Hinduism. Southeast Asia was Hindu, and then parts of it became Buddhist later. East Asia all became Buddhist. Central Asia became Buddhist. But these were not being ruled by Indians. It's not that Hindus went from India and conquered these areas and therefore they converted. So that is a very interesting way in which the religion spread. But let me start right one of the earliest instances we see of the influence of Indian religion and philosophy. So, how many of you have, a lot of you have heard of the Pythagoras theorem, right? Which is a mathematics theorem. Now, Pythagoras was actually a philosopher who was in Greece in the 6th century BC. And he is known, not too much is known about his life, but he's known to have traveled out of Greece for 7 years. People are not exactly sure where all he went. Probably to Egypt, which would have been one of the closest places, and then to Persia, which would have been the great empire, and then maybe to India. We don't know. Or he would have met Indians in both Egypt and certainly in Persia, because Persia used to rule the area of India west of the Indus. So there would have been a number of Indians in the Persian court for sure. So they were actually, because one of the most interesting things, when they were digging in Babylon. Babylon is Baghdad today, and it was a very important city in the Persian Empire. They found these clay tablets from the 6th century BC belonging to a banking house called Murashu. They used to have banks at that time also, 2,500 years ago. In one of them, they found actually the entry for a loan given to an Indian lady to set up a restaurant. So we can comfortably say it is one of the first, it's the first NRI Indian restaurant that we know about, 2,500 years ago in Baghdad. Now, Pythagoras came back from his travels, and he had with him, he had become a vegetarian and he was preaching vegetarianism. He had a philosophy of the transmigration of souls. What is that? That the soul is eternal and it gets reborn into other things. And he also had the Pythagoras theorem. So we think he must have definitely come into contact with Indians. The Pythagoras theorem is something the Indians knew, maybe in 800 BC. There is a Bodhayan Sutra which describes it. But it's also something the Egyptians knew. It's also something the Babylonians knew and the Persians knew. So he could have picked it up from there. And besides that, the other thing is that Ashoka, as you know, he sent out missionaries to many places to convert to Buddhism. So he sent them to Sri Lanka, to the eastern part, East Asia, but he also sent missionaries to Egypt and to Greece and the other important countries at that time. And there are Western scholars who say that the concept of a monastery where you have young unmarried men who are living together for religious purposes is something that the Buddhists started first, right? You didn't have it in any of the religions there, like the Roman or the Greek or the Jewish. So there are people who say because there were monasteries in Alexandria and in parts of Egypt, the Christians there picked it up, and that's where the concept of monasticism started. Now let's move away, thousands of kilometers away, to Korea. So now in Korea, uh, there is a story about a lady who came to Korea in a ship in 48 BC. That's about 2000 years ago. Korean history talks about her, and they say there is this Princess Surya Ratna from Ayodhya who came, and she married the king of Korea, and they had some 8 children. Uh, they had some 10 children. 8 were named Kim, and 2 were named uh, uh, Hyo, after the mother. And so many Koreans today, about 6 million Koreans today, say that we are descended from her. They trace descent from her, including the last president of Korea. So much so that you see this statue which is there. That statue is something that the Koreans have come and built in Ayodhya as a memorial to the their mother, as they say, grandmother, Hyo Hwang-ok. And this is a picture of her tomb in Korea. And there are these stones there. You can see the picture of some stones. Now the story is that these stones were on the ship to provide ballast and all that, and they came on the ship from India, and they are kept there at this tomb in Korea, and they have been tested, and they are from India. So that is a very interesting ancient connection that we have with Korea. Now I want to move on to China. Our biggest conversion happened in China. How did it happen, So Ashoka had sent missionaries, but not so much to China, and that's not when they converted. You see, there was this king called Kanishk who was a Kushan, and he ruled over North India and also Central Asia and parts of Eastern Iran and some parts of Western China. He had a huge empire, and in that empire, basically the road from China to the West became safe because you had a king who was maintaining law and order on it. And as many of you can guess, this road used to be called the Silk Route, right? So you had a lot of travelers traveling up and down, and merchants who would be taking silk from China, spices from India to the Roman Empire, which was a large and rich empire and a big customer for all these products which were traveling down this road. But it was not only goods traveling, there were also monks from India who traveled up the Silk Road to China, thousands and thousands of them. So here I'd just like to say that Bhagwan Buddha, he used to end each of his sermons by these words, Charaiveti, Charaiveti, which means chalte raho, keep moving. And he had told his monks, you are not to rest in one place except for the 4 monsoon months, the Chomasa. You have to be on the road for the rest of the time. And he also said, do not wait for a group. He used to say, you should wander alone like a rhinoceros. So if you've seen any pictures of rhinoceros, they are always solitary, right? Anyway, so all these monks on their own would go up the Silk Route, and many of them slowly they converted China to Buddhism. One of the most important of them was Kumarji. Now I don't think, mostly people have not heard of him in India. We have no records of him in India, but he was a Kashmiri monk. So Kashmir used to be a huge academic and a university center in ancient India, both for Hinduism and Buddhism. So he was a Kashmiri monk who went to Kucha, which is in Central Asia. And from there, it was so famous that the Chinese emperor wanted to invite him to the court. He didn't want to go, so he sent an army to get him. The army captured him, but then that general kept him for a while. There was a lot of fighting over him. And finally, after many 10-15 years, he managed to reach the Chinese emperor managed to get him to the court, where he was declared the Rajguru, or the national teacher. And he set up huge translation projects where they translated thousands and thousands of Sanskrit books into Chinese about Buddhism. And you have his statues all over China. So this is something you can research. Here is an Indian who basically almost, so Kumarji was just one of the monks. There were many other monks, Amogvarsh, Padmasambhav, people like that who converted a lot of China to Buddhism. So this is some work which was done by individual Indians, and we should celebrate that. Now, I'm going to tell you another story about a very fascinating Indian. I don't know if you've heard of him. So there was this South Indian prince. Again, this is a story which is there in the records in China. And in India, we have no record of this story. So there was this prince called Bodhidharma, and he was from South India. So these are the Chinese records of the Shaolin Temple. I don't know how many of you have seen these kung fu movies about Shaolin. So there is a Shaolin Temple in China, and they have these records. So there was a prince, and he abdicated his powers, became a monk, and then his guru told him to go north. So he started going north, walking north, crossing the Himalayas, came to China, met the emperor, was quite cranky, and the court is not where he wanted to be, walked out of the court, and he was being followed by, so there's one General Sheng who got very impressed with Bodhidharma and started following him, ki make me your disciple. But Bodhidharma was not interested, and then then he came to the Shaolin Temple, where he meditated outside for 9 years because the monks wouldn't let him in. And today, if you go to the Shaolin Temple, they show you this cave with an outline saying, this is from the light from his body, this outline was created. So anyway, then he finally went, he was invited inside the temple, and he taught them the theory of Dhyan. So the Chinese called Dhyan Chan, and then later this philosophy went to Japan and it started being called Zen. So, and he is called Damo in China, and he is called Daruma from Dharma in Japan. So he was a very influential thinker, and his whole theory was about internal dhyan and all that. But besides that, because he was a warrior prince, he knew these very good exercises to stay fit and for self-defense and just to concentrate himself. So in South India, you still have some martial arts like Kalari Payattu and all, which must be similar to what he must have done in his time. And he taught the monks those martial exercises to stay fit. And that then evolved into the Shaolin style of Kung Fu. So that is the origin of the Chinese martial arts, which then later became Kung Fu, and then karate in Japan, and Taekwondo in Korea and all. And there is this picture of a little wooden doll that you can see. This is called the Daruma doll after Dharma. And you can see, like, this is a Chinese painting of Bodhidharma. And you can see these, in the doll, you can see the beard and all of that. So this Daruma doll is considered a good luck symbol in Japan. Even today, millions of Japanese keep this Daruma doll in their house and they change it regularly. So here is somehow how we influence the religion and philosophy of so many places in the world.
So I want to tell you 3 quick things, okay? I think we're running a bit short of time, but we'll rush through. And okay, so the first fact I'll tell you is that in the 10th century AD, there was a king called Yashovarman, who was a son of some king called Indravarman. And he wrote a commentary on Patanjali's famous book on Sanskrit grammar, which had been written 1,000 years before that. The second thing I would tell you is that in the 5th century AD, there was a king who gave up his throne voluntarily, and he traveled up to go spend the rest of his life next to the Ganga, just so that he could get moksha, he could get liberation of his soul. when he dies. He wanted to die by the side of the Ganga because a lot of Hindus believe that that's when you're more likely to get moksha. Third thing is, again in the 5th century AD, close to this first king, a new kingdom came up where the nobles spoke Sanskrit. The official language was Shaivism, matlab the worship of Shiv. And it had cities like Amravati and Indrapura. So now if I tell you these 3 things, won't you think I'm talking about Indian kings and Indian people and Indian kingdoms? But I'm not. I'm actually talking about some places which are really far away, 5,000 kilometers away from India, specifically in Cambodia and Vietnam and Indonesia, etc. So this fascinating story, we don't know very much about it. Today, people are quite familiar in India with, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia even, and people, Bali. Everybody wants to go there, for a nice, not too far away vacation, to go to the beach, do shopping, have some nice food and come back. We don't realize that for 1500 years, from the 1st century until the 15th century, India basically exported its complete way of life. Matlab, everything to do from its culture and its religion and its ethos and its language and, to this entire huge region, so much so that Indians themselves call this region Further India. And the Arabs were trading obviously from a very early time. So they called it Eastern India. And the Europeans, when they came later on in medieval times, this whole region was known as Indochina. Today, we don't think of it as Indochina. But in those days, it was known that it had very close relationships with India. One of the biggest contributions was, so you can see this whole area, which is there in yellow, was Indianized for a very, very long period of time. And one of the biggest contributions of India, which we can still see there today, is their script. You go to Thailand or you go and see the scripts some places in Bali, for example, etc. You'll see those round kind of the rolling script. And actually, if you compare it, it looks quite similar in the first look to Southern Indian scripts like Tamil. And there's a reason for that. Because 9 different national scripts came from the Pallav Brahmi. So all of the scripts of many of these countries originally came from the Brahmi, which is the same script that gave rise to all Indian scripts today, from Bengali to Hindi to Marathi to all of the South Indian scripts as well. And what the other interesting thing is that from the 1st century onwards, you had lots and lots of trade ships that used to go there. And they used to go mainly from southern India, from the eastern coast, and also from Orissa. And so you start seeing that not too many people would kind of settle down there, but you had a lot of back and forth contact. So they took with them Sanskrit. So the oldest inscriptions you see in places like Laos and Cambodia are not in their own scripts or their own language. They're actually, if you research it, the oldest dated its inscriptions that you see are in Sanskrit, actually. And we first hear about this region in Indian texts. We know that, as Archana mentioned, that Ashok used to send his Buddhist monks to different countries. So we hear that he did send a couple of people to a land he called Suvarnadip, which is, Suvarna is golden in Sanskrit, and Dweep is island. So the golden island. So we don't know much beyond that. But we do know that from the 1st century onwards, there was a lot of contact. But people from India didn't more or less go and settle down there. You had the first kingdom was in Cambodia, and the legend of that is, it's called the Kingdom of Funan. And the legend is that there was a Brahmin called Kondinya who went and married a local princess there. And he started this long-lived 400-500-year empire. And what's interesting is, because all of these things are legends, how do you know how much of it is true? Many Cambodians do have a genetic marker, which are called haplogroups, and they allow you to trace where your paternal, your father's side, ancestor originally came from. And the haplogroup H is a very specific Indian thing, because the evolution of it happened in India. So people who have it, they say, are definitely from India. So like a large percentage of Cambodia, and I think almost 12% of Bali, even today, has this haplogroup H. So we know that, okay, for sure that there was some descent from Indian people. So whether it's from Kondinya or not, we can't be sure. Now, Funan was a country where, you know, they would have all of these Sanskritized, it was a Hindu kingdom. Everyone spoke Sanskrit. You would have, you know, I think Indravarman and Jayvarman and names like that, which, you know, sound completely Indian to us. Next door in Vietnam, you had this kind of empire which lasted for like 1,000 years called Champa. So you guys might have heard of the flower called Champa, right? And it seems very Indian to us today. But Champa is actually the ancient Indian name for Vietnam. And this particular flower, in fact, is not directly from Champa, but they say that whenever you hear the word Champa, it actually means that you get something, there were things that we were importing from there. And that used to have Shaivism as its official religion, and all the nobles would speak Sanskrit. Now, in Cambodia, the most illustrious empire was the Khmer Empire, which started about the 9th century AD. And it lasted for 600 years. And, oh yeah, so over here you can see, if you see a few of these statues, you will not be able to tell whether they came from, you know, they don't look, except for maybe the Hanuman in Thailand. We can't really tell. So they had a very well-developed sense of sculpture, which also there was a lot of back and forth of Indian craftsmen that would come, and they would get influenced and also put their own local influences in them. Now, this is one of the largest Hindu temple complexes in the world, and it's not in India. This is in Angkor Wat, which is in the city of Angkor, which was the capital of the Khmer Empire. And Angkor is just a way that they used to pronounce the Sanskrit word Nagar, so which means city. And it's dedicated to Vishnu. And you always see that they followed a lot of the same styles of temple building, especially from Orissa and Tamil Nadu. So if you actually go and compare, you'll see that they have the same thing as you have Mount Meru, which was, you know, the mythical home of the gods. You have those South Indians, temples, they have those large gates called the Gopurams. So they also have that, etc. Now, over in Indonesia, you had all of these different empires like Sri Vijaya, and you know, then you had the Shailendra dynasty and the Prambanan complex. So this is the Hindu Prambanan complex, and a lot of them were, some of them took over Buddhism later. So many of these countries now we think of them as Buddhist countries. So most of them were Hindu in the beginning, and then many of them became Buddhist after. And then after that, they even converted to other religions like Malaysia and Indonesia. Much of it converted to Islam. But then when there were these Hindu and Buddhist empires, a lot of them were rivals, and then they would start off in Java. They would do all of this amazing temple building to outdo each other. So this again is one of the largest temple complexes, which has, I think, 250 temples. And from pre-industrial times, you don't see things like this, which still survive in India. So it's quite interesting. In Thailand is mostly Buddhist. We go there. But it's quite interesting because the king is supposed to be the incarnation. Today, if you can read the news, you're having a lot of protests against the king. But the Thai kings are supposed to be the earthly incarnations of Vishnu or Shiv, even though they believe in Buddhism. And if you go to, even the airport is called the Suvarna Bhumi, the golden land. So every country wants to be the one which was the Suvarna Deep, which is mentioned in the ancient Indian texts. And I just put this sculpture there to show that, at the back you have a Gucci shop, and in the front you have this very elaborate statue of the Amrit Manthan that you won't see even in India today. But if you go all across Southeast Asia, you'll see all of these things. Very important to remember that for these 1500 years, it's not that the artists just, some traders went and just settled down there and then there was no more contact. A lot of people would go to India. They would think of India as like a place to visit. And many of them would go and stay in the universities there. So, for example, some of the Javanese empires even built a dormitory for their own students in the famous Nalanda University, And you'd have scholars that were invited over to the courts over there. You'd have a lot of back and forth going forward. One thing which is very interesting is that many of these countries today don't even follow Hinduism, right? We only think of Bali now. But even when they moved on to different religions, they basically became very, the Ramayana specifically plays an extremely important part in their national culture. So even, for example, Indonesia, you have, the Kakavin Ramayana, and they still have a lot of their theater and a lot of their dancing and a lot of their literature is based on the Ramayana, even though they may not have anything to do with it in a religious way anymore. So it might be the national epic of these countries. And each of them, it's really interesting because they would change the story a little bit. So for example, in Thailand, and I've just put photos of each of these different kind of dance forms that are done. And so in the Thailand one, I think Hanuman is much more important. In Indonesia, you can see that Garodia is, the Jatayu is being captured. And in Cambodia, it's called the Reemke. So that's also one of the national epics. Even in the Philippines, which we never think of as being part of this world, you have a very important version of the Ramayana which is called the Maharadia Lavan. And it's an oral folk tale more than a national epic. But I think by the time it traveled so far, people got confused and basically they changed the name of Ravan and Ram. So basically Ravan becomes the hero and Ram becomes the villain in those things. So it's quite an interesting thing to see how Southeast Asia was so influenced and so close to India culturally. And it's just something that people don't really talk about anymore. So I'll just hand it over to Archana for.
Okay. So now I'm going to kind of zip through a little bit. We're going to talk about food and what food things went out from India. So spices, of course, is the most important thing. We used to be the big exporters of spices. The Romans came here for pepper. Vasco da Gama and the Europeans came here for pepper. And a lot of the history of travel and the expenditure which the Europeans did on building ships and navigation was basically to come to India for spices. Columbus was trying to get to India by sailing west, and he was looking for spices and pepper. So and he discovered America, which then of course has had a huge impact on the world. But I'm not going to talk about spices because again, this is something you have, everybody talks about. I'm going to talk about one thing that you don't know came from India and spread to the world, which is the chicken. So, did you know that all the chicken in the world have originated from the Indian jungle fowl? So the first time I saw this, I said, okay, as animals migrate, they walk, they fly, and they spread all over the world. So that is how it must have happened. But actually, when you investigate the history, and I looked into it further, that's not how it happened actually. The chicken was something, it cannot fly very well, and it's not very mobile. So it was something which was actually exported by the Indians to the other countries, both, like cooked, as well as the live birds. And slowly, because it's really good for its eggs and meat and all, and people like it slowly spread to all other countries. So we know that the Harappans used to export chicken, because it's there in Babylonian records where they talk about the royal bird from Meluha. And in Lothal, which is a old city, Harappan city, where they found a building with a lot of chicken bones near the port. So we don't know whether that's actually an achar factory, a chicken achar factory, where they would cook the chicken and pickle it and export it, because Lothal was an export center, or maybe it was just a restaurant. I don't know, but so what we know about the chicken, however, is that it went to Babylonia, then it went to Egypt. From Egypt, it went to Rome and Europe, and then it spread all across Europe. Similarly, it went up the Silk Route to China, along with travelers who would carry it, and then slowly it became popular in China as well. So, this is something about the chicken. Now, I'm going to talk about another Indian product which we don't even realize and what impact it has had on world history, and that is sugar. So, I don't know how many of you know, but sugar essentially comes from India. The sugar cane was first cultivated in Southeast Asia and came here. But the juice was first, the sugar was first extracted from sugarcane juice in India. And it was something very precious. The word sugar, comes from shakkar, which you must be familiar with. The word khand gives rise to the word candy. Khand is lumps of sugar. So now India used to export sugar, but it was as precious as spices. By weight, sugar would be available in the West at about roughly the same price as pepper or any of the which are now far more expensive than it today. And it used to be so in the West they used to use honey for sweetening, right? They didn't have sugar. You had a Greek traveler who came to India, who said that in India they get honey from reeds. He was referring to sugarcane. Now, sugar became a status symbol. People who were very rich would have these sculptures made out of sugar, and in their parties, and it would cost a lot of money. I'm talking about the 13th century, 14th century. um, so the Arabs picked up the technique of sugar cultivation, and wherever they went, they would try to plant sugarcane and extract sugar. So the Arabs, during their big expansion, they were ruling in a lot of the Mediterranean islands, right? And then you had the Crusades in the 12th century, where the Europeans took back these islands. And so then the Europeans were controlling some sugar cultivation in these islands. Now, what happened in the 13th and 14th century in Europe is something called the Black Death. There was a plague, a pandemic. So we are going through a pandemic, but a certain number of people are dying. But the Black Death was so bad that one third of the population of Europe died in that 100 years. So one third of the people died. So what happened is the cost of labor rose a lot, and you couldn't find any people to do these very heavy labor intensive kind of work. And that is when the Europeans said, how do we get people to work on it? Because they had hardly any, they didn't have so many workers left. People had died. So they then started raiding Africa. And this is also the time they invented cannon and guns and all of that. So they became very much more powerful than the people who didn't have guns and cannon. So they started raiding, capturing Africans, and making them work as slaves in these islands. Now you have to remember that more or less slavery, the Romans and Greeks used to practice slavery, but by the 4th and 5th century, slavery had finished in Europe. You didn't have the concept of slavery. But it came back after 1,000 years only to grow sugar. Because they said there's a lot of work required and we cannot afford to pay people so much. And then so once they started doing these slavery in the Mediterranean islands, once they started moving across the Atlantic, they took sugarcane cultivation and also slavery to cultivate that sugar. So Columbus actually in his, I think, right almost in his 3rd voyage, he'd already taken sugarcane to grow there, because it used to be like white gold. You would get enormous price for the sugar, and this went on right till the 18th century. So this is one food from India which actually, you can say, gave rise to the modern day black slavery, which probably, if the sugar cultivation concept hadn't been there, it may not have happened. This kind of slavery may not have come back. This black slavery may never have happened if it was not for their desperate need for sugar and sugar cultivation.
You have to think about that the next time you have a spoon of sugar or a sugar cube, when you have it. So, one second, let's zip through. Now, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to visit the Iron Pillar of Mehrauli in New Delhi. It's near the Qutub Minar. And it's this really miraculous almost kind of pillar, which is just been there since Gupta times. And everyone wonders, and for a long time scientists didn't know, why doesn't it rust? Like everything rusts. And how was it possible that it had not rusted in all these years? What people don't realize is that steel we think of, to build skyscrapers and modern construction and industry and things like that. However, steel was invented in India, actually. And Indians just didn't invent this steel by putting, what is steel? Iron is brittle and you are able to infuse some amount of carbon in it to make it flexible and strong and rust proof. So we think of it as a very modern thing, which started with the Bessemer project in the mid 19th century in Victorian times in England. Indians knew about steel, they knew how to work steel, and they were the world leaders in producing steel for hundreds of years. And there was a special type of steel that they used to use, which is called wood steel, okay? And it used to have these particular kind of watermarks that you can see on these daggers. And it was all the rage. It was as early as, 400 BC, they were doing this. It was so popular that even in the Persian epics, they would, the hero who was going around defeating all of his enemies, he would always have the best of everything. And the best of everything meant that he would have a sword made out of the finest Indian steel. And Alexander the Great, when he came, he conquered just a little bit, and then his soldiers forced him to go back around 327 BC. And he took like tons to about 2.7 tons of steel ingots with him, just so that he can have weapons made for himself and his army. And the thing is that, again, the Arabs learned how to do this, and they would actually take a lot of the ingots from India and do the forging of the stone, of the swords in Damascus and other areas. So, like the Arabic numerals, this steel became known as Damascus steel. And basically what it was known for is, again, you can see these special water kind of marks. And it was known, there were all these legends that, you throw gauze up in the air and you slice through it and you can cut it in just one slice because it stays so sharp. So I think I'm going to go on because we really have like literally 3 minutes left. So Archana, do you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, you want to talk about the iron pillar?
Oh yeah, sorry. So then now recently scientists have discovered why it doesn't rust. So basically they analyzed the composition of the material, and they realized that it has a more than usual percentage of the chemical phosphorus, okay, in it. What that means is that there's a chemical reaction when the iron is exposed to the air, and I think it becomes hydrogen phosphate hydrate, which is a chemical compound, and it coats the iron. So the first layer of air which touches the iron makes this protective layer, so nothing will rust it afterwards. So in fact, when they dug in, they saw that the little bit which was inside the ground, because it had not been exposed to the air, had some signs of rusting. But because of the phosphorus, they were able to, it just makes a coating, and that's why it can't rust. So it's just very interesting to see that this happened. The interesting thing is this technology of wood steel was completely lost to us. And today nobody knows how the ancient Indians did it. Because after the failed uprising of 1857, the British were like, okay, as long as if you guys can't make your own weapons, then what are you going to fight with us? So they went around and they actually systematically destroyed all the technology, especially which was very popular in South India. And this whole process has been lost to us. So you have all of these enthusiasts today on YouTube, you can Google it, all of these Western enthusiasts also who make YouTube channels saying they're trying to figure out how exactly using the old techniques the Indians would have made the steel, but nobody's been able to crack it yet. So it's one of the mysteries which is still there.
Okay, so we come to the last topic. I'll just take 2-3 minutes, though of course we can talk for a long time on this. So Indian medicine and Indian surgery. So Indian doctors were always very famous. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Charak and Charak Samhita. Charak was a doctor who lived, a scholar who lived 2,500 years ago. And he compiled a book in which the medicinal properties of about 600 plants are detailed. Obviously, he couldn't have observed all of that in his own lifetime, right? So he himself says that it is a collation of the work of a lot of people, because you observe the behavior, you observe the properties, you observe the reaction of people to that plants, and you, so it's very interesting how in that day and age where there was hardly any writing, how this information was collected, how it was collated, how it was put in a book together. That is very interesting. You didn't have the internet, he can't Google the properties, so where do you learn about all these things? But anyway, so the Indian doctors were very well known for their knowledge of medicine and also for their knowledge of surgery. Now this is something very special, and I'd just like to tell you a small story. So ek baar there were these British doctors who were so when the British army was fighting with Tipu Sultan in the late 1790s, their bullock cart driver was caught by the enemy and his nose got cut off. So they were they were being very sympathetic. Tumhara naak kat gaya, it's so sad, what will happen? And so he said, no, it's not a problem. There is a potter in my village who will regrow my nose. So he said, what are you saying? Nobody can regrow a nose. So he said, no, there's a person, he'll do it. I'm not worried. So they followed him. They went with him to his village because they wanted to see this magic. How will they do this? So what they saw was that that potter who didn't have enough work, so he had to work as a potter, but he had learned this technique from his ancestors. Their potter cut a flap of skin from here, and he twisted it and got it down in the shape of the nose and stitched it here, and then he put these two dandas to make the nostrils, and then he stitched it up, and then he put all these herbs and all, and the nose grew back, not very fancy because he was not such a good artist, but he got back a nose. So these people were thrilled. They drew the entire process and they published it in London in a magazine, and it gave birth. Can you see the drawing of how they do this? So it gave birth to the science of plastic surgery. And that was, so this is called rhinoplasty. Rhino means nose in Greek. Now, this technique was pioneered by this gentleman called Sushrut. We have a book called the Sushrut Samhita. Sushrut used to live 2500 years ago in Varanasi, Banaras, or Kashi. And he has given detailed, there are a lot of details in that book of various types of surgeries, including nose and um, cesareans. There are about maybe more than 100 instruments. And when I talk to modern doctors, they say actually the design of these instruments is not very different from the modern day instruments that they are using for surgery. Um, and so Indian doctors basically became very famous for being able to do very interesting things, because they had hundreds of plants which would have properties. They would have uh, so they used to be called in various countries. And here I'd like to share the story. How many of you have read Arabian Nights and heard of Harun al-Rashid, right? Harun al-Rashid was the Sultan of Baghdad. And so he was an actual person. And one of his ministers, the most important ministers in his time, were this family called the Barmakids. So the Barmakids they were scholars from Central Asia bulk, and there this minister's father had been a Buddhist. He had converted. His father had been a Buddhist scholar, so they really were familiar with the amount of science and medicine and knowledge and all which was there in India, because they had seen all those Sanskrit texts. So they set up a translation project, but they also set up a big hospital called the Bimaristan in Baghdad, and they made an Indian the head. So this guy's name was Kank. That's mentioned in the books. And then he also set up a translation project for the medical books and collating the Indian medicinal techniques. I'll just end now with one small story, last story. There was a Byzantine king called Justinian. Not the main Justinian who built Hagia Sophia, but Justinian II. He was known as Rhinometos, which means cut nose, because one of his relatives caught him, cut off his nose, and deposed him. And a person with a cut nose cannot be king. Then he vanished. Then he came back 2-3 years later with a nose, got together some people, and actually conquered the kingdom again. And the speculation was that he may have met an Indian surgeon, or somebody may have used the Indian surgery technique to restore his nose. And they found a statue of his recently, or they've identified a statue as his. And if you look carefully, there is a triangular scar on his forehead, which is what you get if you use the Indian plastic surgery technique. So I'm just leaving this with you. Of course, there are so many other things, but I think we have come to the end of our time. So
Archana, they are getting impatient because some have very diligently sent their questions. Okay. So I quickly will run you through the questions. Do
you want to?
One, of course, is the quintessential.
Sorry,
Shruti? Yeah, please announce the contest. Who would like to announce? Yeah.
Let me. So we are doing a contest. Please write in 200, 300 years. The details of how to write in will just be told to you. Imagine you're a traveler from India who is visiting Cambodia in the 11th century AD. What is familiar from back home and what is very different? So research this. You'll be very surprised to see how many things were adopted there and what was different. This is
during the Khmer Empire that we were talking about.
Okay. So that's the
Archana, if I can run you through the questions quickly. So there's a boy called Parth who has been really listening to you attentively. So he has the maximum number of questions. One is, of course, when was zero discovered? Which was the first subject that was found in India, which perhaps he means, what did we specialize in the first, these two questions. And then he also asked about a picture that Shruti showed in the Southeast Asia presentation with Sanskrit inscriptions. So he was asking, when was that discovered? And should I just run through all the questions, or do you like to answer these?
No, I think let's take it one by one because we won't remember, no?
Yeah.
Archana, would you want to start? Why don't you start?
Okay, I'll start. So what was the first question? When was zero discovered?
Zero discovered, yeah.
So as I said, the earliest representation we found is in a manuscript in the 4th century AD, the Badakhshali manuscript. You can Google it and see, I can type the name of the manuscript here. You can look that up. But clearly, the Indians were using it, because when you see the mathematic tracts of, say, Aryabhat and people like that, some of they do, it's clear that they have the knowledge of the zero. So yes, somewhere maybe 2000 years ago, that is about the time the use of zero came about in India. I think the second question was that what did Indians specialize in, or which was their earliest skill? So I'll just
Yeah.
stick to what we were world leaders in. We were world leaders in textile technology for sure. The first place cotton was dyed, the first place it was printed. We were world leaders. And medicine, and one of the reasons for medicine might also have been that because we're a tropical country, we have so many plants available. There is much greater biodiversity in India, and there are enough people who are falling sick. We always had a high population. Indus Valley was the highest population Bronze Age civilization. So if you have a lot of possible solutions and you have a lot of problems, normally something gets formulated. So medicine, steel technology, um, and city planning, which vanished. We were the world leaders in things like storage and showers and flush toilets and things like that, which we didn't talk about because, as you saw, even with this, we ran way over time. So, yeah, that was something which the Indians had. So that a couple of things to go on with,
In
and
the,
of course,
yeah,
religion and thought.
I am rushing through it because,
Yeah, let's rush through it.
right. Yeah. So about the Sanskrit inscriptions that we saw.
So basically, they would have been around, but they have.
Do we
been
have any
dated.
idea when they were discovered?
I'm not sure when they were discovered, but they've been dated to about the earliest ones. I think have been dated to about the 5th century AD. That they've dated them, that's when they were made. But I think it would have been known.
So these discoveries all basically happened, after your
British
discovery is what? It's basically, I'm sure the locals knew it's there, but they came into the greater public sphere with the Europeans getting there in the 19th century.
Because they had a big concept of science journals and
like the
documents.
Laos in Southeast Asia, the oldest Sanskrit description is about a king, I think, who is dedicating a reservoir, who has made a reservoir, and it's about how he is as wise as Yudhishthir and as brave as Arjun, and things like that are written on it, which is interesting. So you can look this up. It's in Laos. It's the oldest Sanskrit inscription in Southeast Asia.
And there are many others in the other countries as well.
It's not much older. It's the Rudradaman, by Rudradaman in Gujarat. So because we have older inscriptions, but they're not in Sanskrit. Sanskrit actually had gone out of fashion for a long time. Both Ashok and all, they didn't use Sanskrit very much. It came back with the Guptas and, came back in the 2nd century AD.
Okay. All right. Now about that iron pillar, the iron pillar is still standing tall, right? I don't know why many of the children are saying, when was it destroyed?
Yeah, I was reading the chat. It's not been destroyed. Basically, it was made during Gupta times, around the 4th century AD. And it was transferred to Delhi by one of the Delhi Sultanate kings. I think it was Firoz Shah Tughlaq, if I'm not mistaken.
No, the iron pillar was actually, it's not in situ. We don't know who transferred it. Like Firoz Shah Tughlaq transferred the granite pillars, and we have the records of that.
So, but it was
the iron pillar, the scientists have analyzed, it wasn't there. It was probably might have been in another location.
Exactly. But it was made around the 4th century AD.
That's when it's got an inscription about Chandragupta Vikramaditya. That is Chandragupta II. So it's probably he put it up. Okay. The main area of Delhi in those days, where you find the in situ inscriptions in Delhi, is around Nehru Place, the Kalkaji Mandir. There is an Ashokan, that is ancient, and you have an Ashokan inscription not far from there. So that would have been the main space of Delhi.
I have a very interesting question, and that might be the last
You're breaking up,
You're
Swati.
breaking up. Please repeat.
Should Shruta ever fail in any of his operations?
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure he must have failed in many of his operations. Actually, it's interesting. In I was talking to a doctor recently, and they actually had to study the Sushrut Samhita. He's from AIMS. So he said we actually had classes on what Sushrut had, and he said that he actually used to recommend that when you wash a wound, you should do it with flowing water and not stagnant water. So he had some
Have
concept
the
of
windows
that being
open. The
better.
other thing was you should do it next to a place which has a lot of
Air.
air
And he said
circulation.
there should be good air circulation for the patient. So again, there's this concept of virus congestion. He was just saying that in the context of the corona. And in Banaras, they kind of show you a place a little downstream from Banaras, where they say he used to have his school here, and they would actually go out in the night and catch the dead bodies floating down the Ganga to do dissections, because you cannot become a good surgeon without doing dissection. And how do you get, in all traditional societies, dissections were very frowned upon. It was not really something very acceptable. So they say ki from this ghat, he and his students used to get
Yeah, the tour guides tell you.
dissections,
Right.
which is
All right.
interesting.
Archana, Shruti, and I'll take the last question, which actually this question could lead to a full-fledged session, but we can't have that. Is some children are asking that, is Ramayana imaginary or is it true, and what is the proof?
Okay.
That's vast.
Shruti, you want to
Yeah,
say?
sure, I'll take it, no problem. So obviously, I think for people who are genuine believers, then I think it's a moot point for them, because they will believe whatever they believe in is really happened in the way that it happened. So you see that in all religions. You see that in the Bible. There are many people who believe that everything in the Bible happened, whatever, again, in other religions. So there will be some people who will believe that everything in the Ramayana happened. From a scientific point of view, or from an academic point of view, I would say that normally what they find is that there's a kernel of all of these epic stories which happen in ancient Greece, also ancient Persia, etc. There's normally some sort of small story that was the truth. And what happens is it became famous in its own time. And over the years, as it gets retold and retold, there are more and more miracles and magical things which are not necessarily what we are able to observe in our human life, which get added to them. So I'll give you one small example where they used to think that the ancient Greek, like, Helen of Troy. Some of you might have heard of Helen of Troy, who a lot of the Greeks fought with each other. There was the Trojan War. So you hear about the Trojan horse and stuff. So the people used to think ki us time, that's not a real thing. It's a legend. Exactly what this question is. And then there was this, I think, German baker who said, no, I want to, after I retire, I want to go and prove that this Troy existed. And he made quite a bit of money in Germany to retire. And then he went off to Greece in the 19th century. And he started reading the descriptions of the places and where they corresponded today, that day in geography. And he started off these archaeological digs. And sure enough, they were able to excavate Troy. So similarly, they have found that, for example, maybe not in the Ramayana, but in the Mahabharata, a lot of the city names, which in India, there's a lot of continuity in terms of language, not in terms of political rule. But I think they found that there's a suburb of Delhi called Indarpat or something, which so they started archaeological excavations there to see if you had, some sort of settlement, which would at least indicate that there was something happening there at that time. Not necessarily that you had, flying vehicles and, supersonic kind of things like that. So I think that's what I would say. Anything you want to add to that, Archana?
So I'd just like to say that when people went and dug in all the sites mentioned in our epics, like Mathura, Hastinapur, Kurukshetra, Delhi, when they dug there, they found that they had a common civilization from about the 1200 to the 1000 BC carbon dated period. And one common factor was something called painted gray ware. So note these words because you can go and Google them. And you should actually go and research these yourself also. Painted gray ware, PGW, and all these places had a common civilization. So we can say at least these places existed 3000 years ago. In the Jatak tales, which is written around the 4th century BC, they have mentioned that Delhi is ruled by people from the Yudhithil Gotra. Yudhithil is the Prakrit for Yudhishthir. So we have some mention of a family of Yudhishthir. So my take on the thing is that certainly it is entirely possible that there were these Pandavas and Kauravas and a dynasty in Ayodhya and all of that. But the details, the magic part of it, there we haven't found any proof of the thing. And even when you dig in these 1200 BC areas, you don't see the kind of grand hall described in the Mahabharata as Indraprasth, built, which Duryodhan got jealous about and all that. So you don't see any remains like that. But this part of the Mahabharata was, I just like to finish by saying this, that the original Mahabharata was something called the Jaya, which was about 8,000 verses. The Mahabharata that we have today has more than 1 lakh verses. So these 90,000 verses were added on over maybe 1500 years to that original poem. And
thank you so much, Archana. Sorry, I'm cutting you short because the children have to go for something else after this. So thank you so much. That was so interesting. That's why we went on. Shubha, may I please ask you to, for the vote of thanks. Thank you.
So thank you so much. We can, I think, listen to Archana and Shruti the whole day. But yeah, time is constrained. Thank you so much, Archana and Shruti, and Swati for bringing Archana and Shruti to us. We are about to conclude, but I want to remind the children that tomorrow we have the session right from USA. Julie Sengupta will be on, and I'm sure you all are looking forward to that as well. And do remember to take part in the contest. We have the prizes sponsored by Kriya Learning. And the prize is Shruti's and Archana's book. Children, don't miss it. Go for it. Archana was the expert in the KBC, if I remember correctly. So it's a book that you should win, right? Thank you so much. See you all tomorrow. Thank you, Archana. Thank you, Shruti. Bye-bye. Bye, children.
Take nice chatting with everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, children. What are you trying?